Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats and welcome to the stage Lieutenant General Bob Wood, Executive Vice President, FCA.
Bring up the lights. Everybody up? Well, welcome back to our third day of MILCOM. Glad to have you with us. We've got a good start to the morning here with a great panel, a panel that I think you'll enjoy as it talks about integrated joint C4 Solutions. We heard the last speaker yesterday talk about integration, a gentleman from DISA who talked about that as a significant challenge. And what we've got for you today is a number of practitioners who are working at every part of the solution. Our first panel had a lot to do with joint of the whole show, talked about joint as not just military service, but industry and a variety of other functions joining with the military and government to arrive at a joint solution. Well, this panel will talk about integrated as it relates to joint C4 solutions. A good number of experts that I'll allow our panel moderator, Mr. Stu Whitehead, to introduce. We do have an expert with us. Mr. Stu Whitehead is SES, works with the J6 as really a key office proponent and director for solutions as it relates to joint command and control. He will be working in that role and talking today about how that is progressing. Bold Quest was one of the solution sets that was featured on the floor at the Government Outreach Pavilion. There's far more solutions, and he'll elaborate on those, I'm sure, as we go through. As usual, our questions will be posed to the panel through the askmemilcom@gmail.com, and upon the conclusion of the panel's remarks and questions that they want to address, we will ask for questions that have come in from the audience. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, welcome back to MILCOM, and please welcome Mr. Stu Whitehead for the panel on joint C4 solution integration.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, General. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to moderate this panel this morning. I think the topic is really germane to our current conditions globally, specifically speed to need. Just to kind of foot stomp some of the comments made by General Wood, we did hear an awful lot in the last couple of days about innovation, acquisition, and the requirements process. And so today, we're going to have the opportunity to kind of put all of that stuff together because we have collectively a pretty diverse panel that will be able to kind of reinforce and maybe talk at a more granular level some of the necessary activities to get us to a joint capability. So this is important because no matter how good the product is, if it doesn't get to the user in time, it's almost not worth the effort. So having a good product, doing it quickly, making a difference on the battlefield is essential to the way that we operate and dominate operations. Of course, speed to need is easier said than done. Things change, the world's smaller, and we become much more connected. And so because of that, I think what we find is that our users become much more savvy in terms of what they want and when they want it and what their expectations are. And so how we think about that challenge is important for all of us. So when we take a look at rapidly modernizing information technology, I think what we find is now more than ever that it's the commercial sector that drives defense, not the other way around. And in fact, I think what we've seen over time, a real blending of what used to be considered, we'll say, business systems and so forth, and warfighting systems, to the point that I think maybe a lot of our policies and processes necessarily haven't kept pace. So I think what we find is, from a military perspective, that our requirements and acquisition processes are typically not agile, not to take offense to what we heard yesterday. But I would also add that for these processes, even when we're talking about them institutionally, fast is a relative term. Also, I think we see confusion over whether something is Title 10 or Title 40, whether it's a program of record or whether it's an IT capability. And if we've seen the evolution from systems, boxes, to services, more on the IT side of the house, we'll say, even our policy and authorities and management and so forth get blended, or they step on each other's toes. And then finally, I think what we see is that military solutions typically lag behind commercial capabilities. We have a great desire to want to leverage commercial off-the-shelf products. That's good, but then we have to figure out how to field it. And so there's a scalability issue that we have to deal with. And then interoperability and integration is usually an afterthought. So we normally focus on the functionality of the particular system at hand, and then we try to figure out how to put a square peg in a round hole. And yet, the way we fight is much more integrated from a process point of view than you might imagine. And particularly at the joint level, we see this all the time, where one service's capability has to inform a step in the process all the way through. So there's much more interoperability and integration demands between and among service-provided capabilities than you might imagine. And then let's take a look at the red team. What we're finding is that our adversaries are using commercial technologies very effectively because they don't care about process. They buy it, they use it, if it works, they keep using it. If it doesn't, they move on. And so their ability to quickly take advantage of commercial technologies is also something that we have to deal with. So as I think through some of the challenges that we're facing, what I'd like to do is briefly introduce some of our panel members so that you know their background, and then we'll give everyone an opportunity to do their own presentations. As I mentioned before, we have a number of skill sets present. So we have assessment folks, we have acquisition professionals, industry partners, interoperability and assessment folks, and IT professionals. So what I would like to do is start with Colonel Linda Jantzen. She's currently assigned as the Director of Army Architecture Integration Center and Chief of Plans and Governance Division in the Architecture, Operations, Networks, and Space, or AONS, Directorate of the Army Chief Information Officer, G6. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Mass Communications from the University of Illinois, a Master of Science degree in Telecommunications from Michigan State University, and a Master of Science degree in National Security Strategy from the National War College. She's a very experienced practitioner with many operational deployments under her belt. So Colonel Jantzen, over to you, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Whitehead. Thank you to AFCEA and General Wood as well. It's my great pleasure to be here today. And thank you all for being here so early in the morning here on a rainy Wednesday morning. As Mr. Whitehead said, I am with the CIO G6 now. I have been an Army Signal Corps officer for 28 years. Most of that time has been in tactical and expeditionary, as we call it now, signal battalions and brigades. And so, as you can imagine, I've seen a lot of technologies delivered over the years, some of them faster than others. It seems they come faster all the time. But as we look at what we're going to do in the future, it's helpful to look back. And as we try to see what's coming in the next 30 years, I think it's interesting to look back at the last 30 years and the technologies that have been delivered just in my career. And some of you will remember some of these, but remember when GPS was a new technology? You remember frequency hopping radios? Fielded those in Korea in the late 80s. Packet switching. These are all in my lifetime, in my career, and it's just fascinating to think about it now. Flood search routing. Embedded ComSec. Electronic mail. Okay, I was a captain when we got electronic mail. PowerPoint, fiber optics, cellular phones, all of those things, just in my brief career. So when I think about the next 30 years and try to imagine what types of technologies we're going to be using through this network platform, it's just astounding. So I don't find it very useful to try to predict what's coming. And from the CIO perspective, I think a more useful approach is try to prepare for whatever may come. And there's a few ways that I'd like to tell you about that the CIO is engaged in doing that. So also throughout the years, whether it was a deployment to Iraq or Somalia or Bosnia, Afghanistan, or you name it, or it was spending months and months in the field at Fort Hood or Korea or wherever you happen to be, the paradigm was the same. You deploy with what you have, you set it up, and you get operational, and then you immediately look around and try to replace it with something better. Once you do that, then you go back to home station and you start all over again. And that is the cycle that we've been in for many, many years here, as depending on what your budget was, how much money you had, how much time you had, but that was the cycle. We need to get beyond this. And again, I'm not talking about predicting the future, picking winners and losers in terms of technology. We can't even predict really who our partners are going to be. But what we have to do is leverage what we have now. And I think in industry we call that operating in a bimodal fashion. Use what we have now, the legacy equipment, if you will, but also prepare for the newer technologies so that when they do come, we can more rapidly adopt them across the network. It's more than just a bandwidth or a transport issue. We need to think in terms of computing capacity, not just bandwidth, not just throughput. At CIOG6 right now, the idea is to deliver value today in service for a future objective. So that's what cloud migration is all about. That's what standards and architecture is all about. And we're trying to develop policies not to constrain innovation, but to provide some path, some direction, so that we can more rapidly absorb the new technologies. So despite our great advances in technology, what we have today is a network, a complex network of networks, really, a complex web of management processes that are all connected together at the top. So if you think about it, we've got, the National Guard has a network, the engineers have a network, the medical has a network. We are a conglomeration of networks that are tied together at the top. And we need to get beyond that and have a true Army enterprise from end to end that serves all environments, warfighting, business, training, and all echelons, from tactical up to the institutional, and we're moving in that direction. Complexity itself is a barrier to innovation and slows down delivery. There's the additional cost and effort from duplicating effort and duplicating results and outcomes across enclaves and environments instead of producing shared benefits across the enterprise. It introduces security vulnerabilities that we cannot afford in this day and age. It increases our footprint because you have to take everything with you, and it's a barrier to scalability and failover. So we are not mutually supporting across, even within theaters, much less across theaters of operations. We need to modernize the network from end to end. We need a secure, integrated, standards-based environment with global access. So just a couple of the ways that are ongoing now that the CIO is contributing to achieving the vision is one with a strategy. We have multiple stakeholders across the Army. There is no one entity is dictating the way we go with technology, and we can never get to that point. We don't want to get to that point. We want to allow the innovation of the different communities to be able to interact with the network and the data that they need in ways that only they can come up with. And so we need a strategy that unifies the efforts of our stakeholders so that we're all working towards a common end. The CIO has the Army Network Campaign Plan. It's implemented through implementation guidance, which is all published and on the website. Through the efforts of the G357 and CAC, we have the Mission Command Network focused end states, which again, we share common end states, and we are working together through things like the Common Operating Environment to achieve those end states. The second thing, and full disclosure here, I am the acting director of the Architecture Integration Center, but it is architecture. We need architecture. We need to define our standards. We need to define what it is we're looking for so that industry can build to that. And so we don't end up integrating after the fact. It's not that we lack a standard, it's that we have too many standards, and we really need to settle on what we're doing. That's not to say that we choose something and then stick with it forever. It needs to be constantly evaluated with an eye towards what our functionals need to do and what our industry best practices are so that we can adopt those into the Army and how we run our networks. We need to align with DoD and the Joint Information Environment. We need to standardize our data management practices so that data is visible, accessible, understandable, trusted, and interoperable. And this will all set the foundation for rapid delivery of technologies into the network. So I'm happy to talk about any of these topics in more detail. I'm very happy to be here to learn from you and to share with you what's going on from the CIO perspective. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Whitehead.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. Now you've heard from an IT professional. Next, you'll hear from an acquisition professional. Lieutenant Colonel Joel Babbitt is the Product Director, Wideband Enterprise Satellite Systems, which reports to the Project Manager, Defense Communications in the Army Transmission Systems. Joel holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology from Brigham Young University, a Master of Science degree in Computer Science from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He's a member of the Acquisition Corps with a Level 3 certification in Program Management. So, Colonel Babbitt, over to you.
Thanks, sir. And thanks to FCA2 for this opportunity to be here today to talk about speed to need. So, I've been a product manager for the Department of Defense since December 2007, minus a few months for schooling here and there, CGSC, et cetera, in 3 different organizations. For SOCOM for 4.5 years, doing C4I there. And then for the Army, I was the product manager for WinT Increment 1 for the past 3 years. And for the past 2.5 months, I've been the product director for the Wideband Enterprise Satellite Systems, which puts in the big dishes, big 12.9 meter satellite dishes for DISA, for the Missile Defense Agency, and for a few others. So in that 7 to 8 years, I've spent about $3.5 billion on IT technology for both SOCOM and for the Army. In trying to make those capabilities happen, I've certainly found a number of challenges that my industry partners out there will probably nod their heads and say, and that my acquisition brothers and sisters out there will certainly nod as well. First of all, we have this requirements process called JSIDS, which typically takes between about 2 and 4 years to make a requirement happen. So the challenge with that, of course, is by the time you've defined the requirement and by the time it's gotten through all the wickets, some in the IT realm at least, I'm not talking tanks, I'm not talking artillery, okay? In the IT realm, 2 to 4 years is a lifetime. That's a tech refresh. That's a complete overhaul of your network is about ready to happen. About every 5 years is the complete overhaul of the network. So just figuring out what we want to do and taking 2 to 4 years to do that puts us 1 generation behind where we need to be. The POM process, usually POM is how you get your money in the Department of Defense. It typically takes 2 to 7 years to sometimes get money. Depends on whether all the stars are aligned, et cetera, and whether you're able to make the politics happen. So there's a triad of things that need to happen. You need to have the acquisition stuff in place, you need to have the money in place, and you need to have the requirements in place. I just talked about how it takes 2 to 4 years to get requirements, 2 to 7 years to get money. On the acquisition side of the house, we have this ACAT structure, ACAT 1, ACAT 2, ACAT 1D, ACAT 1C, et cetera. And what this acquisition category structure does is it designates certain programs as important enough that they have the honor and the pleasure of spending 3 to 8 months trying to get through the Pentagon wickets for every major decision that they need to make. That's 3 to 8 months where you're not doing useful work, where you're preparing to do useful work, preparing to get stuff out there, whether it be in preparation for a milestone B to finalize your development, or whether it be in preparation for a milestone C and to prepare to start deploying this particular capability. That's a lot of delays. So how do you get past all of that? How do you get speed to need? How do you identify a need and get speed to that? Well, I haven't even mentioned the fact, but I will. We have a Congress. They have their own, they have very specific duties that they do. But for an acquisition professional, it's kind of like having a board of directors that's 535 members strong and that have vigorous debates amongst each other, and all of them have an opinion as to how the direction your program should or shouldn't take. In addition to that, on the other side of that, you've got customers. And the famous quote from Colonel McLaughlin, who I used to work with back in the day, who's now the SOCOM J63, just saw him yesterday, is, "Joel, I want it now. If I wanted it in 3 years, I'd ask for it in 3 years." So ultimately, you've got to get to speed to need. If you're going to make things happen fast, there's a few ways in which you can do that. And there's a few ways that during these past almost 8 years that I've been a product manager for the Department of Defense that you can do that. First is leverage established programs as a springboard. When I was the product manager for WinT Increment 1, I stepped in right after we had finished fielding the last of the joint network nodes. Awesome program. It was a total success. Ended up LRIPing, low rate initial production 14 times, never got a full rate production decision. But because of the war, we were tracking the patch chart of deploying units and equipping them with JNNs and command post nodes and that sort of stuff, network infrastructure, as they were preparing to go into theater. So I stepped in just as the unit had finished fielding, the very last piece, and they were getting ready to field a number of upgrades. We were able to take that and continue to field upgrades to meet the current needs of the Army, not just what the needs of the Army were back when we started fielding, and evolve the product over time to get to things such as virtualization, a host of other things, KA, putting KA on not just KU, etc. So you need to look for high-impact, low-cost innovations in established programs, especially in a time of dwindling resources within the Department of Defense. The second thing is stay in touch with the units. A number of acquisition professionals out there don't know any of their counterparts in the active force because they come from a different branch. I've had the distinct opportunity, being a signal officer for the first 10 years of my career, I've had the distinct opportunity of knowing half of the Division G6s. There are people that I was a company commander with. There are people that that I served on this or that staff with, that I was a battalion SIGO with, etc. These are folks I know. So when they're looking for network upgrades, when I was WinT Increment 1, they'd call me. They knew me. I would go to them. I would figure out what they were doing. You need to support the ONSs, the operational needs statements, that get through the JSIDS process in months instead of years. You need to support the directed requirements, which are essentially the hot topics for the Army G3. But you also have to know which ones are actually going to get funded before you go too far with it. Third thing, you need to innovate via integration and avoid costly developments. So ultimately, just remember this: developing something from scratch or from close to scratch equals slow. Integrating mature technologies to meet a particular need equals fast. And oh, by the way, you're probably going to get it right. Taking something through the development cycle, often by the time you get to the end of that development cycle, if you've bit off more than you can chew, it's a really hard time getting it to actually meet the warfighter's needs. If you start with small developments, start small, win big. So either small developments or quick integrations, that's how you get to fast. Fourth thing, understand how the end of the fiscal year works in the government. Turns out, if you always have a contract ready to put money on, there will always be money to put on your contract, because there will always be somebody else that can't execute their dollars, and they'll be calling you, and it will be August 16th or September 4th or something of that nature, and they'll be asking you, hey, we've got these excess dollars, can you execute? Sure, I've got a contract ready, and turns out I've got a UFR in, an unfinanced requirement, something that needs funding that matches that contract. Put those together, about 80% of the time I've seen them funded. So you got to get your good ideas and your customer needs into UFR form. If you do that, you've clearly identified a need, and when the end of year comes, just get ready, be ready with a contract ready to go. Fifth thing, form coalitions so that you can leverage other people's mature efforts. Okay, again, Win-T Increment 1. Well, actually, so back at SOCOM, I started an effort called Jolted Tactics, Joint Operational LTE Demonstration of a Tactical Cellular System. Mother of all acronyms, it's awesome. Anyway, that Jolted Tactics, that name that my tech manager really came up with, we passed that over to Greg and his folks at the Joint Staff J6 to make into a JCTD, a Joint Concept Technology Demonstration. And without stealing any of his thunder, ultimately, later on, we in the Army, I went from SOCOM out to be the product manager for the Army's Tactical Internet. Didn't know it. It turns out I was the transition agent on the other side of that. So, of course, I knew where to go to find, how to meet the Army's cellular requirements. I went to them to get SIPR Wi-Fi, which is preparing to field throughout command posts throughout the Army this coming year. We formed what we initially called the Coalition of the Willing and then renamed the Wireless Coalition to capitalize on the success of other organizations. Cicero once said, "Success has many fathers, failure is an orphan." If your program has nobody claiming credit for it, you've got problems. But if everybody wants to claim a little bit of credit for what it is that you're doing, then, well, success has many fathers. You'll likely be successful. Last thing, overall, be proactive. Never accept the status quo. Always ask, if you're trying to tune your program for speed, never just accept a timeline. Always ask, can we do better? What can we do to make this better? Innovation needs to happen not only in technology, but innovation needs to happen in how you form your schedules, how you work with your contract partners, or from a contractor perspective, how you work with your subs and how you work with the government. You have to innovate in all aspects of what you're doing and always have a back shop that's got a little project going where you're getting ready to meet the needs of the future. With that, sir, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thanks a lot there, Joel. So next we'll hear from our industry partners. Justin Keller is the Director of Advanced Programs in Military Space Systems, part of Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company. He works with the AEHF and MUOS program managers to ensure those systems remain relevant to the missions that they support. And he is the lead for international partnerships for MILSATCOM services and products and for the MILSATCOM customer outreach. He is a retired Air Force officer and alumnus of the Joint Staff J6. He has a bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering from the University of Texas, excuse me, and a master's degree in nuclear engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology. So, Justin, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to spend a little time doing a case study to basically reinforce the points that Colonel Babbitt made about our ability to deliver at the speed of need. I'll focus on MILSATCOM. That's what I do now. Work for a small entrepreneurial company based in Bethesda, Maryland, and we see across the board things that work and don't work. So what I'm going to talk about on using MILSATCOM as an example about what are the trends that drive the speed of need, and then I'll do a test case to see whether we've been successful at delivering that as an enterprise across the government and industry, and then offer out some suggestions on how to adapt so maybe we can do better. So we'll start with the next one, next chart. There's several factors that affect the need for change and adaptability within the MILSATCOM architecture. I want to focus on one of them here, which is the changing nature of the threat, which is related to the unstable world that we live in. All these factors have implications on the MILSATCOM architecture and the designs of those systems, starting with the resurgence of peer adversaries, the fact that any tactical conflict could have strategic implications means something to those of us who work in the MILSATCOM business. The same is on the lower end. The proliferation of commercial technologies means also the proliferation of well understood techniques for jamming and interference, and that problem gets harder as time goes by. There's more and more concern lately about the potential for a nuclear armed Middle East, and if the deal that was just signed goes through and nobody cheats, we're looking at 2025. If that is the time frame in the mid-2020s when we might expect that type of capabilities, what that means is systems we're designing and building now are what we will have to take to a conflict if one is required in that time frame. I'm not sure we're prepared for that. And then finally, in the brave new world we are, there's orbital threats that people talk about, and those again, I think, weren't considered in the JSIDS process that we went through. I had to laugh at your JSIDS comment. I remember a former Secretary of AT&L, who will be named, called JSIDS the enemy of the state, which when you're trying to deliver at the speed of need, I agree with. Look at the next chart. So how did we do in responding to these change? Well, this is kind of a look back over the last 25 years or so of how we've delivered MILSATCOM capabilities as an enterprise, starting with DISCUS, transitioning to WGS. Then we had MILSTAR abortively, then moved to MILSTAR 2, then abortively moved to Advanced DHF, and then abortively moved to TSAT. And while we have big step changes along the way, there has been very little opportunities for incremental adaptation throughout those programs. So that puts pressure on the acquisition community that I better get this right because I'm stuck with it for 20 years. And that's not delivering at the speed of need. And then the same is on the narrowband side. There was UFO, pretty much the similar capability, followed by MUOS, step-changing capability, great capability, but again, there's opportunities to evolve that and make it adaptable to these changing trends that we haven't taken advantage of. So I would say we have not delivered MILSATCOM as an enterprise at the speed of need. I would say we've done a pretty good job of adding order of magnitude changing capability every decade or so, but it takes us about a decade to figure out what we want and another decade to deliver it. So I think there's a better way, and I think we'll look at the next chart as to why we need a better way. So the types of trends that we look at that influence MILSATCOM, I talked about threat earlier, but there's also operational experience, the changing requirements and doctrine and new platforms, stealth aircraft, missile defense, new network technologies. You know, MILSATCOM only exists to extend the range of terrestrial networks. And as those evolve, we need to stay with that. Technologies change, and then the economics change. The point I'm trying to make is not that this is a comprehensive list of the type of trends that affect MILSATCOM. It's that the pace of change is accelerating. And the acquisition experience I showed in the previous chart has not kept pace with that pace of change. So from an industry perspective, we need to be thinking of innovative ways to adapt to that. And right now, the one I think we're more focused on is the threats. The threats are really what are growing in ways that weren't anticipated back in the JSIDS process, and we need a process that can help us adapt to that. And there are ideas out there. We just need to take advantage of those. So on the last slide, just some takeaways. We need to build in our future MILSATCOM systems and architectures adaptability. There are a number of ways to do this, to anticipate, embrace, and adapt to change, whether it's technological, new weapon systems and doctrine that we're supporting, or whether it's threat-based or whatever. The other thing that's new is I think we had a respite from at least threats to SATCOM during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. Those were fairly benign environments from a MILSATCOM perspective. I don't think we can fight that last war again. I think the next conflicts, we will encounter threats to our systems, and we need to be able to adapt to that. And that means, unfortunately, maybe a little bit more than what the commercial industry can provide today. So within the MILSATCOM area, we need to do things that adapt to the threat and provide real protection rather than just thinking you can get by with, well, they'll ignore me this time. And finally, there are capabilities out there on both, at least the systems Lockheed Martin builds in both advanced THF and MUOS, to start adapting to those threats. I won't get into that today, but there are potential solutions to get started down that path, taking advantage of what Colonel Babbitt said. Leverage your programs of record as a springboard and evolve those over time to stay within the speed of need. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next on our panel is Mr. Jeff Phipps. He's assigned to the Defense Information System Agency, DISA, in their Joint Interoperability Test Command at Indian Head, Maryland. His primary focus is on coalition and multinational interoperability. He is the JITC Coalition Team Chief and Manager and directs numerous coalition interoperability efforts, including holding the roles of the U.S. Mission Partner Environment Executive Steering Committee Coalition Interoperability Assurance and Validation Work Group. That's a mouthful. And he leads the U.S. CIAV National Lead, representing the U.S. in a variety of U.S. international engagement. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree, summa cum laude, and has numerous academic and professional honors, including winning the DISA's Director Award in 2011, specifically for his work in CIAV. So, Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Greatly appreciated. Thank you, General Wood, AFCEA, for the opportunity to speak here today. Evidently, I've already won the longest title award, so I'll expect that when we're done. A little bit about me, 27 years, Department of Defense, split between uniform, defense contracting, and government civilian, different positions. So I've been to a lot of places, seen a lot of things. I was an Air Force communicator for my military career, and that was evenly split pretty much between fixed and tactical communications. But in 2001, I was working tactical communications at Air Force Special Operations Command. So in September, we got to go on a few trips of that year. One would be to stand up initial comms at Masira Island. We went to Pakistan, went into Afghanistan. And one of the things I noticed while we were there is we had partners with us. We had Australians, we had Brits. And guess what? They had their own capabilities, and we had our own capabilities, but we had no network that they would all work together on. And I'm giving you a little bit of history because I want to come up and talk about some of the things that were already said on the panel today. But so when we were deployed in the initial stages of Afghanistan, we had to do some things that probably aren't exactly the right way of doing things in order to get the mission accomplished. So that kind of set a mantra of mission first for me, and I've carried that through my current duties within the Joint Interoperability Test Command. And the last 12 years, as Mr. Whitehead said, I've been focusing purely on coalition interoperability or multinational information sharing, those types of efforts. That has also given me the opportunity to work with a couple of industrious lieutenant colonels here at CENTCOM J6, and Mark Hoyt and Dave Wills. I'm sure some of you know them. They had a little project that they were working on called the Afghanistan Mission Network. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. The Afghanistan Mission Network was, there was a lot of planning involved. The advent of that network was because we had really bad command and control in theater, because we had numerous nations that come in with different networks, different capabilities. I know the commander on the ground there had multiple terminals on his desk, multiple phones, and it got to the point where he couldn't effectively command and control. So Mark and Dave were tasked with developing the Afghanistan Mission Network, working with NATO, working with our partners to try and bring everything into one IP-based network infrastructure. They were successful with that, and during the planning, I had the opportunity to work with them and talk to them a little bit about interoperability and how things were going to work once we turned this network on. The planning sessions for that network were great. A lot of nations came together, NATO came together, and actually planned it out well from primarily a core services standpoint, but also from a C4ISR standpoint, because a lot of the capabilities that were going to be brought into this environment had never had the requirement to interoperate in that environment before. So we knew there were going to be problems. Just taking a purely analytical look at it, a lot of capabilities built to different standards, built for different purposes, different tactics, techniques, procedures, business processes in place. So we knew there was going to be a huge learning curve, and we were right. For Afghanistan, we've been primarily a reactive capability, and when I talk about we, I mentioned the Coalition Interoperability Assurance and Validation capability that we have, or CIAV. We came together with NATO, with the UK initially, and stood up this group because we knew we were going to have problems, and it's since grown to 20 nations plus NATO today. But I tell you all this because once we figured out that there were going to be interoperability and integration issues, especially from a C4ISR perspective, we started working on that. We came up with a mission-based interoperability type mindset because we didn't want to slow down the process, obviously, but we wanted to give the deployed commanders on the ground at least some sort of assured interoperability perspective so that they knew what was going to work, what was not going to work, and how it was going to affect their operations, capabilities, limitations, and operational impact. So we were successful at that, but like I said, we were primarily facing it from a reactive perspective. So we put a few things in place. We found out that once we started identifying these limitations, that every PEO, PM, commercial vendor, everybody wants to do the right thing. Hey, there's a limitation, let's fix it. Let's develop a capability, let's integrate a new capability, let's come up with a patch, let's do this. But a lot of people don't look at it from a holistic perspective. So one thing you can do, you can fix one problem, but you can create three more whenever you do that. So there needed to be a structured process in place in order to handle the new technology insertion and upgrades. So what was developed was called a forward schedule of change, or a strategic roadmap. And each nation came together and said, okay, these are the capabilities we're going to be integrating. These are the changes we're going to be making. And we tried to align that across the different nations. And if you think service interoperability is hard, or joint interoperability is hard, try combining all that and adding 30, 40 nations together with their individual processes and trying to get that aligned. So it was no easy task, but I think they were fairly successful at that. Being able to align those would increase our capabilities by ensuring that when one nation increased their capability or fielded a new system, it didn't break the interoperability with the other nations. And that's one of the things that we saw in Afghanistan is everybody's trying to do the right thing, trying to build capability, but if you fix problem A, you could cause problem B, C, and D. So the forward schedule of change, the strategic roadmap, and implementing some type of process so that we don't have FSRs running all over theater, making changes and upgrades that are out of control without some sort of structure there. Now, I give you this history or this use case to bring you up the point now. And I am by no means an antagonist of speed to need. I am probably one of the strongest proponents of speed to need because, as many of you, I've been on the pointy end of the spear, and I've needed these capabilities and needed them now, as was stated earlier, and not 3 years from now. But I also caution that there needs to be a little bit of risk reduction applied to this. We need to understand that when we deploy capabilities, although we may be solving one problem, we could be creating other problems, and look at it from a holistic standpoint. One of the things we've been successful at from a coalition interoperability standpoint is being able to do that. And we have an offline environment where we have, as I said earlier, 20 plus nations, and it'll probably be growing to more this year. And when each nation makes a change in their coalition baseline, as we call it, we bring that change into a lab environment, or we at least do a desktop analysis to understand what the ramifications of that change are going to be on the coalition fight. Whereas it may be great for the service or great from a joint perspective, in a coalition environment, it may or may not actually increase capability to the warfighter. So that's one of the areas that we're definitely looking at from a coalition interoperability standpoint. And from a U.S. perspective, we got to get better at being service, joint, and coalition interoperable. I know a lot of the services are good at making sure their internal capabilities are interoperable. A lot of them are pretty good at joint interoperability, but coalition's a different paradigm. We have to understand that it's not just us and them, it's we. And our coalition partners have capabilities and information that we're going to need in future engagements. And so it has to be that type of environment, and I call it the coalition information environment, much like the joint information environment. And that's a whole different world. So when we're thinking about moving forward and bringing in new capabilities and capability integration, we have to take our coalition partners into consideration. From a federated mission networking standpoint, which is the NATO's version, kind of the umbrella over our mission partner environment activities from a U.S. perspective. They have what's called the Interoperability Standards Profile, which many of you may be familiar with. But that's where all the nations work together and agree on the standards that we're going to use for certain information exchange or combat data exchanges. And that's what we need to be building towards. And from a government to defense contracting perspective, those types of things need to be shared. Whenever you're developing new capabilities, they need to align with those. Proprietary protocols, proprietary standards, that's got to go out the window. From whenever we're working with our coalition partners, that's a big negative to being able to successfully accomplish the mission. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have Commander Greg Allgaier, who is with the Technical Integration Service Branch of the finest part of the Joint Staff, the Deputy Directorate for C5 Integration in the Joint Staff J6. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Armstrong Atlantic State University. He has an MS in Applied Physics at the Naval Postgraduate School. And he's been to the U.S. Army War College with a master's degree in national security and strategy. Among his assignments, he served as the Maritime Strike Officer for Striking and Supporting Forces in NATO from 2008 to 10. And during that tour, he deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan, where he served as the commander, for the commander of the International Security Force, ISAF, as a shift director in the Combined Joint Operations Center. So, Greg, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. I'd also like to extend my thanks to AFCEA and General Wood for inviting me to be part of this panel. As Mr. Whitehead said in my bio, I have deployed to Afghanistan, and I've had a chance to see some of these systems work in interoperability. But beyond that, I've also served on 5 ships at sea, predominantly in engineering, and that's where a lot of my experiences come from. I'm not a professional communicator like a lot of my distinguished members up here on the panel are. But I am a communicator just the same because I use that capability in order to do my job day to day. I'd kind of like to open up with an anecdote. It has absolutely nothing to do with communications, but it has to do with an engineering system on board an Aegis cruiser, a very simple system, the fire pumps. And the reason I want to bring this anecdote up is even the same lessons that are learned or the things that you see applying to non-communication systems also apply to communications and applies to assessments, which is what's really important, is making sure that we're getting this capability right. So about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was the chief engineer on one of our Aegis cruisers, I had the opportunity to change out the fire pump coupling system. These are big, huge, hulking, the pumps themselves and the motors, a big, huge, hunking, big, large hunks of metal, and they're coupled together and joined together with it by a shaft. If you have to take one of these systems out in order to fix something as simple as a couple of drops of a seawater leak, you've got to pull the whole system off, and then in order to get it back together and that coupling aligned, it requires a laser precision and alignment. It's not a capability that most ships have underway at sea, so you either have to fly out an expert or wait until you get back. So the Navy looked at that problem and said, there's a better way. And through a full-up assessment of a capability to improve this coupling system, pull the shaft that's connected apart and replace it with 2 magnetic plates. So as one spins, the other one spins. They're not attached together, so if they're not perfectly lined, it's still okay. The tolerances are better. You can fix it at sea. An average sailor can do it. Big win. Fully tested, fully evaluated, supposed to be good. You know, next thing best to buttered bread. Well, I put one of those systems on my ship, and I found out that the bearings were starting to fail a lot more rapid or more frequently than they ever did. Why? Because that holistic approach was not used. The assessment was not right before giving me this capability. As a result, these magnetic plates, they're about 12 inches in diameter, and they weigh a lot. So on the inboard or the inside sides of that coupling, those systems are now getting way too much pressure on the bearings they're holding in place, and we're throwing the bearings, we're throwing the alignment. I can work with a couple of drops of seawater leak on the original system until I can get home. I can't work with a pump that's throwing bearings, so now the whole system's down and out of line or out of commission until we can get the bearings fixed, and that's a much bigger job than just fixing up a seawater leak. My point is the assessment has got to be right. And so when I hear speed to need, and we were talking yesterday in preparation for this panel, and one of the other members said, you know, a great phrase, you know, where you stand is from where you sit. When I used to sit on the receiving side of speed to need and a new capability was coming out, I'd be like, okay, here comes another piece of junk. Well, that's not really the case. We know that. We work really hard on this side of putting capabilities and extending those out to the warfighters, that we're not putting out pieces of junk. We're putting out the best products that we possibly can. But how do you make sure that that product is the best that you can? You've got to do the assessment. With communications, Moore's Law, the speed of technology's advancements being faster than being able to write the requirements and plan form, as we've talked about through some of the other opening remarks this morning, it's hard. So how do you do that? One of the things that we do at the Joint Staff is we're using the try before you buy approach. We've heard try, buy, fix, go iterative cycles. Well, how about a try before you buy? Work with partners, work with industries, and work with your customers to find out what the requirements are. And in the small ones, twos, small items, small procurement numbers, try out the new system. See, does it work? Does it interoperate? Desktop analysis first for assessments, followed by a lab assessment, and then taking it into the field. Taking the lessons learned and applying them. Improving the system, bringing it back, trying it again. The Jolted Tactics project that Joel mentioned earlier today, he was exactly right. This was a capability that was developed by SOCOM. We took it on board, partnered with other organizations as part of the Joint Capability Technology Demonstration. We took it to the field for the first time for an operational utility assessment as part of the JCTD in May of 2014. The user experience was not what we had hoped it to be. We learned a lot of lessons. We went back to the lab, we worked back with our partners, and we improved it. Very specifically, we leveraged our partnership with the NSA in order to explain and represent the services and the requirements of our warfighters and explain to the NSA, who we were using their commercial secure solutions for classified system in order to encrypt and secure the network, that what might work in in small environments, as it was originally developed for, does not work when you're talking about soldiers on the ground that need to be able to bring up a system right away. We took that information back. We got a new product. We assessed it in the lab. We verified that it was good. We verified that it was secured. We then took it to the field and conducted 2 more demonstrations in this past, in 2015, both of which turned out to, I think, to be very excellent demonstrations of the capability. Also, by demonstrating that capability in order to meet that speed for need, is now the visibility of what that does for our warfighters is propagating across the force. And instead of trying to sell this capability as being able to help our warfighters, we have ONS being ridden by 82nd, by 75th Rangers in order to get this out, the technology out there as fast as we can. Joint Staff doesn't field. We turn the solution back over to one of the program managers, programs of record, in order to field. But now, as the programs take it through the full operational testing that they have to do, it's already been technically vetted, it's already been tried, it's already been validated as being a good capability. Because that's what assessments is all about. It's trying to determine, is it good or is it not quite ready yet? And that's what we do in the Joint Staff, and that's how we help move things forward for speed to need. Frankly, not everything has to work the first time out, and I think that's probably the biggest lessons learned. As long as we understand it, capture the data, go back and make the system better, and make sure that it works before putting it in the hands of our warfighters, that's what assessments is all about. And I close by quoting Thomas Edison when he was said that he did not fail at 10,000 times or however many number of times of inventing the light bulb. He simply just found 10,000 ways that didn't work. Sir, thank you very much.
Okay. All right, so you got quite an earful this morning from our panel members. I just want to kind of contextualize a lot of this by saying, if you really take all of these comments together, what have we talked about? We've talked about good requirements, architecture, standards, making sure we have a good dialogue with our acquisition partners, with our industry partners that actually are going to produce the capability, and then making sure that we do the right integration work, whether it's how it's, we'll say, performing in a joint environment or, as we've heard, in a multinational environment. This is really full cycle management, and as you see, it really takes a team effort working together in order to get things done. So I'll start with a couple quick questions, and then we'll hand it over to all of you for further questioning. I want to start with Colonel Jantzen. You mentioned having architecture and standards are important, and I guess my question to you is, given that, how do we ensure compliance?
Thank you for the question. Compliance is important, but it seems whenever you say compliance, especially to my good friend from the acquisition community, that means rigidness and confining him to one solution or another. But that's not what we're after in terms of compliance. We're after, as I said before, setting a standards profile, and then ensuring that all our stakeholders are following to that, and that our industry partners are building to it, so that we end up with something that can be interoperable in the future. But one of the most effective things we're doing now is working with JITC so that they can run test scripts and processes in order to assess and provide feedback on the level of compliance of a certain system with our architecture. And this has been done before, I know, in different ways, but the key to success is it's not a static process. We take that feedback. It's not a pass-fail. It's not a way to say you're not compliant with the architecture, so therefore you're not the solution. It's just a feedback mechanism so that either we need to not adopt that system, or perhaps we need to adapt our standards and our architecture to integrate that new technology. Perhaps that's a better way. So there needs to be a continuous assessment that way. So we just started this. JITC is incorporating it into a pilot that they are running right now. And it's a really exciting opportunity. Now, we're trying to be transparent about this, so we're using what's called the DoD IT Standards Repository, the DISA, in order to publish these standards profiles and make them available to the testing community and the acquisition community. And this is how we create that formal handshake to maintain our interoperability with DoD, also the intelligence community. So that's probably the newest thing going out there.
I would just add too, from the joint perspective, I think what we've learned over time, it used to be when we had these tome size requirements documents that for all of the pages that we produced, we shied away from things like standards. And that was sort of the purview of the acquisition community. I think what we've learned is that collectively, first of all, we want to have, if you want to have an agile product, you have to have agile requirements. So at least in the Joint Command and Control arena, we've necked requirements documents down to about 10 pages, very discrete requirements for a particular capability. They're done in a context, of course, but that makes it a lot easier for the developer. At the same time, particularly when it comes to things like interoperability, I mean, we've literally worked from policy all the way down to articulate the standards that are necessary, at least we believe, for interoperability. So I think that also helps where we don't leave things up for interpretation, and that if we get our foot in the door quickly on interoperability, then we don't have to fix it after the fact. I'd like to ask Justin if you could respond a little bit, or maybe talk a little bit more about how you're dealing with evolving customer requirements. How do you keep pace, particularly in an area that's as complex as yours?
So it's a multi-pronged approach. But the first is, and I think the OSD CAPE is actually came up with the idea, which was they called it EASE. Evolutionary acquisition with technology insertion. And I forget what the E stands for. But the idea is you have a common product line that is constantly providing capability over time. And so you don't wait on these decade-long big bangs, and then throughout you anticipate, or your users anticipate, your customers, what their needs are going to be. I'm concerned about this threat that's maybe there in so many years, and then you can insert technologies quicker before you launch the satellites, and then even build in adaptability into the system so you can do on-orbit upgrades and adapt over time. You can look at the ability to do new things on orbit, different orbits. So there's a range of things you can do. You just have to think that way. It's a change in mindset. And one of the things, when we have a range of recommendations and ideas, but then we go to the customer and they go, well, there's no requirement. It hasn't gone through JSIDs. But you look out there, you're like, we know they're going to need that. So it's a cultural change, it's a process change, and then it's a mindset change to make sure we can do the program in a way that responds to those type of needs.
Great, thanks. So one last question for me, for the panel. I heard it mentioned yesterday in one of the sessions that some of the best solutions are bottom up. And I just open that up for anybody to respond.
So I'll take that one. A lot of times at least in the U.S. Army Acquisition Corps, product managers get their requirements from what's called a TICM, a trade-off capabilities manager, and they go and start to vigorously execute on those requirements. And the first time that an actual user of the system, a person that's going to be fielded this particular system, sees the system is during some sort of operational test after the capability's already been developed. A much better way of working, and then, by the way, when you get to operational test, they have a huge amount of feedback that if you'd just known that a year ago, it would have made your life so much better and so less, it would have lowered the rework that you had to do at that point. A much better way to do it is to stay in touch with the operational community, noodle it through with them as you've got these requirements coming down the line. Get the right answer. I've always been a fan of the saying that if you give somebody the right answer, they'll give you the right answer back. So from a product manager perspective, you can't leave it to the TICMs, the trade-off capability managers, the people who write these requirements in JSIDs. You can't leave it exclusively to them to tell you what it is that you need to build. Yes, they start it, but as a product manager, you have to go to the bottom, that is to the soldiers, to your peers out there that are Division G6s from an IT perspective or whatever, to folks that are in the operational units that you're going to be fielding this to, and figure out whether what you're getting ready to produce is actually going to meet their need. Run it by them a few different times as you're going through developmental testing, as you're making a choice to go this way or that way with a particular product. Run it by those peers of yours, figure out what will scratch their need at this point in time, what challenges they're facing that you can fix, because ultimately, if you bring a product to them at the end and it didn't come from the bottom up, a top-down problem is going to get the, not created here, look, I've got other missions I got to make happen, your stuff is a bolt-on to what I need to do, these are the needs I need to make happen sort of response, instead of, that makes my problem easier, that fixes my problem, that solves my problems, that gets me the solution I need for what I'm doing now. Bottom up is much better than top down when coming up with solutions. That's where you find a lot of those brilliant Imagineers out there in the G6s. And I use the word Imagineer because they kind of imagine all these cool things they want to have happen, and then you have to engineer it. You got to work with the Imagineers out there, grab their awesome ideas, figure out what the challenges are that they're doing, pair the two together, bring in your own good ideas, mix it all together, and produce a capability that when it gets down to the bottom, it looks like it came from the bottom up.
Great, thanks. So I'll open it up for all of you. Happy to take your questions.
First question, how will a U.S. flavored concept of mission partner environment fit with a NATO flavored concept of federated mission networking?
Great question, and we'll be talking about that over here later on, but just to kind of cut to the chase, they're the same. So Allied Command Transformation, which are the authors of NATO Federated Mission Networking, is about a block away from my organization. And so we work hand in glove to make sure that anything that's being developed on the US side for MPE is identical to NATO FMN. The practical example of that is our experience at Bold Quest, where we used the joining membership and exit instructions from FMN for our MPE event. So it's the same, and as we move forward, we will ensure that the spiral development associated with FMN is also reconciled with any development on the US side. Anybody else want to jump on that? It's kind of my thing, so I could answer that. Okay, next question.
This question is for Colonel Babbitt. Sir, with your background in SOCOM, do you see any aspects of their procurement processes or rapid fielding ideas that you could recommend for broader use in the Army?
Absolutely. So let me lay out the challenges for you, Army versus SOCOM. I knew somebody was going to ask this question, though I have no idea where you are because the interrogation lights. But, so I wrote up a few notes. First of all, you have to understand the difference between SOCOM and Big Army, right? So, the first thing is scope or size. In the particular unit within SOCOM that I was the C4I product manager for, the focus we really had was at the individual operator or perhaps the team level, sometimes at the task force level, sometimes at the enterprise level. All of those had different speeds at which we could field. One example was the X-band microsat system. We ended up fielding about 200 of those, just teeny little dishes. They're out here. Tampa Microwave's got one of them. There were 3 other vendors that were all selected, and we fielded a mix of dishes from those 4 vendors. But we were able to field those 400 because it was all about the team. Those 200 dishes because it was all at the team level. Okay, now let's take it to the Army. I was just the product manager for WinT Increment 1 for the past 3 years. To do an urgent replacement of all of our Cisco routers throughout the world in 1,275 battalions, 155 brigades, 18 divisions, 3 corps, and 5 regional hub nodes, it's a lot, isn't it? Took us 3.5 years with 60 fielders. That was a massive effort, and actually it's just finishing up this coming year. And it was urgent because we had to replace all these routers because they were going end of life, and unfortunately, we'd figured, somebody before me had figured out, let's standardize, let's get all the routers to be the exact same router, which means in all of those units, they all expired at the exact same time. That was awesome. Good choice. So instead, we phased it in with different routers over time so that, 6-8 years from now when the IA certifications expire, they won't all expire at once and we can actually replace, periodically. Do you get the difference in scope or size? SOCOM has a hugely different, size parameter than Big Army. Levels of approval. For the things that we did in SOCOM, the level of approval was typically my 06, my full bird kernel. For the stuff that we do in the Army, as an ACAT 1D product manager, my level of approval was the Honorable Mr. Frank Kendall. And I had, 6 levels of approval to go through before I ever got to him. Fortunately, I transitioned to an ACAT 1C while I was there, which means they gave it down to the Army from the Department of Defense. So I only had about 4 levels of approval there. To get through each of those levels of approval is about a 2-ish month process, unless you're one of the hot topics at the moment. And then it's, can be weeks. To get to my 06 at that unit under SOCOM that I was in was, hey sir, I'm gonna stop by, talk to you about this thing, lay it out for you, blah, blah, blah. Joel, I need slides on that. Okay, sir, got it. Next day, slides, bam, let's make the whole thing happen. Got it, year ago, make it happen. And oh, by the way, if it was a really big thing, well, I had to get the general's approval, and that took about a week. Levels of approval are hugely different. If it takes 8 months to get, an approval on one phase of a project, that's not the same as 1 week to get approval like it does, in most areas within SOCOM. The third thing is from a testing perspective. Within SOCOM, you had the opportunity to build the testing profile from the bottom up. Within the Army, the assumption is you're going to do every bit of testing that God and country ever invented, every piece of it, and then you got to negotiate out 1 or 2 pieces, maybe 3 or 4, to get it down to something more reasonable. In SOCOM, you start with a blank slate. Not so much a blank slate. You start with what the vendors are already doing, and then you build up from there. Ultimately, the lessons learned of SOCOM versus Army acquisition are lower the level of approval if the Army wants to look like SOCOM, reduce the scope, get little wins, and then take them big throughout the Army, and then tailor your testing. Start with what the vendor's doing rather than everything that's out there as your starting point.
That was our final question for the panel. Please hold your applause as we welcome Lieutenant General Bob Wood back to the stage to thank the panel on behalf of AFCEA and our audience.
Well, I promised you we'd see a panel of practitioners and we'd learn a lot from their insights and perspectives. My thanks to the panel, to Mr. Whitehead for bringing this team together. It really has the diversity of insights, I think, that adds so much to the theme we have of how we leverage technology for the joint fight. So ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to thank you once again and formally say that MILCOM will present in your name a donation to the Wounded Warriors Foundation. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panel. We're going to move immediately after this at 10 o'clock. We have Mr. Halverson, the DOD CIO, will be with us. He is in the building. I think he may be in the audience right now. Let's take a quick stretch break and in our seats back at 10, and we'll present the next presentation to you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
have a set of values serving as a foundation for our future.
Trust.
Respect. Collaboration.
Innovation.